also talk about the two discourses and what the relationships are between them, and we can also perhaps have some reflection on what Camilla called the second best list. But before we do that, and I think perhaps particularly leading us in the direction of a little bit more focus on climate finance, Neil, would you like to make some comments? And then I'll open the floor for discussion.
It's very hard to follow three such broad-ranging and thoughtful presentations. So I'll just confine myself to making four rather brief comments, but focusing on the linkages between climate change and the post-2015 development discourse, which is of concern for us today. So perhaps to begin, the day after the UK budget, two quick thoughts on finance. The first point on sources of finance. Under climate finance discussions, a lot of prominence has been given to exploring different sources of finance. As Simon referred, the AGF report had a strong emphasis on moving away from sole reliance on direct budget contributions of developed or industrialized countries. And I suppose my reflection then with regards where aid is going, can we expect to see the same diversity in funding within development cooperation in the next period of aid? Secondly, the whole question of costs of climate change and development. What we certainly see here is under climate finance, there's been considerable attention has been given to estimating the costs of climate change actions in developing countries. A lot of studies work. What I don't see, and what I'd put back to Jan and others, where are the equivalent needs assessments for aid? And how can we move beyond the simple political goal of 0.7% GNI? To follow those two thoughts on finance with two quick thoughts on governance. And firstly, transparency, and transparency over how public money is spent. And again, we see in the climate change world, there have been strong calls to increase transparency and hence accountability of public funds associated with climate change. And this has been a strong demand coming from developing countries. And my question again is, will this have any knock-on effect on development spending? Because as, again, as an observer of that, I just do not see high levels of transparency in both either aid or climate finance circles at the present time. And then to finish on what I see as the big unresolved question, equity. And what's my observation on the climate side would be is concern over equity is not yet well developed. In part because the mitigation agenda had a very strong emphasis of channeling funds to where emission reductions can be best gained. There is a start of a discussion on what vulnerability to climate change actually means and how this might influence both country allocation and, more importantly, as Jan said, within country distribution. How does external resources get to those most in need? And so going back to the development practitioners, what can the experience with aid say on this? So coming full circle, this takes us back to Jan's presentation at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Well, the floor is open. We've clearly got the beginnings of a discussion on the implications of climate financing modalities for development more broadly, and then we've got the broader discussion about the relationship between these climate responses and development, the development framework going ahead. Would anybody like to make a start? There is a roving mic. So if you put your hand up, when you speak, please keep it short. We've got limited time, 25 minutes. We'll try and have 2, possibly 3 rounds. I guess it'll be 2 rounds and responses from the speakers. Please say who you are, where you come from if you have an institutional affiliation, and keep it brief, either as a question or a comment. And just put your hand up. Yes, there's one at the end.
Thank Thank you. My name is Marcus Manuel from the Overseas Development Institute. One comment, one question. One comment, for those of you who've heard about Dutch disease, can I commend to you the new phrase, which is actually Dutch vigour. If aid is correctly invested, you can actually see a recovery of export industries and a more vigorous export stuff, rather than actually the collapse that people have seen on Dutch disease. It's a new phrase that the IMF is starting to use. The second one is, I just need to know the panel views on, do you think the discourse around polluter pays works in the conversation around climate finance? Thank you.
Okay, just, are there any other questions over on this side of the room? Just to keep the microphone there for a second. Okay, it seems as though not, so there are two along here. Just over here.
Yes, hi. Is it working? Yeah. My name is Gianni Ruta. I'm doing research on adaptation finance at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE, and I've also been working 9 years at the World Bank in the Environment Department. Thank you very much for a very nice set of presentation. I found Jan's presentation very thought-provoking. And there is a tendency, and here is my question, there's a tendency to stress the dark side of conditionality. Conditionality, in my opinion, also has a bright side, which is to put forward a genuine inequity aversion of developed countries. That inequity aversion is trying to counteract a lack of inequity aversion at the level of the recipient country. I can use your Nigeria measles immunization example. You want funds to be conditional just because you want that fund to target a specific type, kind of the population. So how do we move forward? How do we balance the agenda without understanding very well the very origin of conditionality and the underlying drivers?
Thank you. Sorry, Fiona Napier with Global Witness. I just wanted to comment on Camilla's presentation, which I thought was very helpful. Looking ahead in terms of Millennium Development Goals, or what are the principles that we need to be getting more global agreement and traction around, I wanted to also add one on consumption. So we're very much looking in terms of some of the positive rights and making more space for those. But if you look at the Nature article, and indeed the limits on some of the natural resources that seem to be coming through, we have to have a debate about consumption. It's starting, but I don't feel it's got to international level yet. People avoid it very politely. I'd love it if somebody on the panel would like to comment on that. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please.
My name is Fatima Yamin. I'm a student at King's College in disasters.
A bit louder, please, or a bit closer.
I think the mic's working. Just get out.
It is
It's
working,
working, yeah. I'm a student at King's College doing disasters adaptation and development, and climate change is a big part of what discourses and issues that we go through. My question is actually quite simple in the sense that there is a sort of there's something that organizations and agencies and actors avoid doing, and that is defining the major elements or the major ingredients that are involved in, that is adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, and even vulnerability. Because once you don't have these things defined, my thinking is that you don't have everyone on the same platform. You have people standing in different places. Now you can define mitigation, resilience, adaptation, and vulnerability in the context of climate change, but then we have disasters around the world that are also part of the climate change scenario. So there's a need, I feel, for defining these different things before approaching them in any way. So just
Okay, any last point? There's one point back here, and then we'll turn to the speakers for some responses and then have a second round.
Hi, Jasbir Singh from CAFOD. I was just wondering where we could unpack the issue of inequality and trying to define it. I mean, does it stem towards land inequality as well, and what kind of ramifications would that have?
Okay. Jan, would you like to make any
Okay.
responses?
Yeah.
Some of them were directed to you.
Yeah, conditionality. Definitely, we are not talking either or. Yeah, it's not overpowering or not engaging. And that's also Colin's point of view. Conditionality is part of doing business, but it's very much a matter of degrees. Inherently, conditionality is the opposite of ownership. You have to be aware of that. So we have to really keep it in its place. And it has a major problem because it is perceived as patronizing and it is not perceived as empowering. It doesn't mean that there is no debate between the two parties in the business, but the practice you and I have been observing, I have been observing it for more than 30 years. It's pretty much intrusive, perceived as intrusive, perceived as patronizing, and it leaves little scope for endogenous change and endogenous progress. The examples we saw on Bangladesh and Malawi, that came from within. Of course, there was lots of assistance there that came, but the driving force was not a donor. And a bit of humility on our side is always good. It's difficult, especially when the people have a lot of money and when they have the same gender as the two we belong to. That's my experience. On needs assessment for aid, yes, we need to do that, but again, a matter of degree. We have seen in the past needs assessments that become kind of scientific targets by themselves. And we are talking about orders of magnitude, very broad orders of magnitude. 0.7 is important, but it will never make much of a difference when we talk about MDGs, when we talk about climate change. If you just look at the history of 0.7, why is it 0.7? Why is it not 0.6 or 0.8 or 2.5? Just read up on the origin of this number and you will probably never ever mention it again. Because it has nothing to do with the challenges we face today. This thing is 40 years old, back of the envelope calculation by Jan Tinbergen, the late good fellow. It's good to have an order of magnitude.
And Hans
but
Singer, we should say.
Sorry?
And Hans Singer.
And Hans Singer, yes. It's good to have an order of magnitude, but also with a deep understanding that it is unknowable. It is unknowable how much it will cost to reverse climate change or how much it will cost to achieve the MDGs.
Okay. Camilla, maybe on consumption goals. And
Well, and on
polluter
the
pays.
polluter pays thing as well. If you look at the figures that Martin Parry is coming up with in terms of the costs of adaptation, you realise that the flow of funds from countries that have burnt a lot of fossil fuels per head to those that haven't but are suffering the consequences would imply a really very substantially larger flow than that which is flagged up in the UN Secretary General's report. But we're probably not going to see those flows happening. Where I think there's more of a likelihood of that kind of polluter pays principle is where you can earmark, say, some kind of levy, such as the International Air Passenger levy, which is already in existence for the French, but might be made more global. And of course, if the levy on carbon could be used for other purposes, such as investment in low carbon activity of one sort or another. Fiona, the issue around consumption, I completely agree with you. I mean, people tend to deal with the problem by saying, actually, it's a population problem, you know. If poor countries didn't have so many children, then, you know, we could solve a lot of these problems. Not recognising that the consumption levels of each person in a country like the UK is 15 to 20 times that of each person in many low-income countries. So, I mean, I think we have a terrible tendency to displace action onto other people rather than think about what we need to do ourselves. The UK government's Foresight report that came out last month that I was part of on global food and farming futures to 2050 recognises that there's a lot that we should be doing here in terms of modifying our own demand for food, as well as cutting waste and a number of other things, rather than just thinking that there's something to be done just on the supply side. Fatima, your point on...
Sorry, Camilla, do you have any thoughts about why there's a lack of momentum there? I mean, this is a massive issue, isn't it? And obviously one which brings the two discourses very strongly together.
Well, I mean, I think there's a sort of small middle-class response in countries like the UK around consuming less, you know, consuming local, trying to make sure that you reduce your impact on resources. But that doesn't seem to be married with a recognition that in many parts of the world you should be encouraging increased consumption so that you've got a better balance, if you like, between consumption in different places. And that's why I think trying to get our heads around some form of equity measure is absolutely vital. I suppose on that we need to find something which is relatively simple and easy to measure. I know that in the context of the bill that Bob Gaveron is trying to take through the House of Lords on equity, he's suggesting that government refuse to procure from companies that have a top to bottom ratio of salaries of more than, I forget, it might be 1 to 10 or it might be 1 to 20, but that you could find some simple measure that said, you know, if you in your company, or if you in ODR, or if you in IID, have an equity ratio in excess of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, then you're doing something wrong. And I think that sort of simple, fairly simple top to bottom measure would be quite a useful sort of benchmark by which to judge different policies or different organisations. I think, Fatima, you made a very interesting point, which I think kind of points us to the need to sort of get stuck in on the ground on a lot of these issues, because a lot of the categories that we use make sense to us in our heads, but actually when you get onto the ground, you know, what's the difference between mitigation and adaptation? Okay, it may be the difference between dikes and windmills, but for many farmers in particular parts of the world, they've got a series of fields and land and water, and they need to find a way in which they build a more resilient livelihood. And if they can get money for one thing rather than another, then they're likely to use it for a variety of purposes that collectively make them more secure, rather than thinking about it belonging to one particular category that has some sort of intellectual resonance but doesn't necessarily fit reality on the ground.
Thank you, Simon.
I have 17 points I want to make, and I'll choose 2. The first is that I wrote a paper in about 2001, I think, recommending an inequality target for the MDGs of 0.42 based on the work of Andrea Cornea. And people said to me, this is completely naive, and I think people were right. I mean, I think the chances of getting an inequality outcome target into the MDGs is not worth getting up in the morning for, frankly. Nobody's going to sign up to that. What they might sign up to is human rights legislation, anti-discrimination legislation, and 1 or 2 others of the drivers of inequality. And that poses an interesting challenge, because those are not outcome indicators, they're actually means indicators. And we keep saying that the MDG should be outcome indicators, but we're not going to get a Gini of 0.42 as an MDG. It's just not going to happen. I want to comment on this thing about Dutch vigour, which I'd like a bottle of. It sounds fantastic. Fight wrinkles, Dutch vigour. It comes back to this point that Jan was talking about: do you invest in human development or do you invest in growth, which sometimes, by the way, are not competitive. And it's an issue that Francis Stewart worked on, if you remember, some time ago, and demonstrated that the countries that were most successful invested in both. But at the margin, there are choices. And what we know from the Dutch disease literature is the point that Marcus made, which is the way to avoid Dutch disease and acquire Dutch vigour is to invest in moving the supply curve to the right. Investment in infrastructure, in upskilling the workforce, in spreading the benefits of innovation around the economy, and not necessarily in providing measles injections for very poor children. And I remember some work that was done from Oxford on this, on Uganda, where it was quite clear that if you wanted to avoid Dutch disease, you didn't spend money on human development issues, you spent it on building the infrastructure and reducing, improving the roads and so on. So here's an issue where we need to be very clear at the margin, what is the balance between human development and productive investments? And the risk is that we get it wrong, and we either do too much of one or too much of the other. And I'm with Francis Stewart that we need a very carefully balanced budget, and that, of course, is a fatuous statement until you go to a country and work it out.
And Neil, you've got
Just a very quick reflection on this very interesting issue on consumption. I think the industrialized countries' emission reduction targets is an important early test of that.
Thank you very much. We've got time for a short next round. We'll go to the back. Over there, there are sort of 3 comments at the back and then in the middle, and then we've got a bunch of comments at the front. I don't know if we'll get to yours, but
okay,
please
thanks.
be brief.
Can I just say thanks so much to the speakers? You've very much spoken to me. I've just had 6 weeks designing
Please say
climate
who you
change. Sorry, Philip Dearden from the University of Wolverhampton Centre of International Development and Training. Very much spoke to me because I've just had 6 weeks designing a DFID climate change program in in Ethiopia, which is absolutely fascinating, and dealing with these financial issues was absolutely key. I want to try and string together a few points that were made. One is around donors, completely endorse all that Jan said around donors. Camilla's points around pipes and plumbing. I'm not sure drip feeding is going to be quite enough in terms of irrigation, in terms of the amount of money we've got to actually push down the pipes, but very, very important. But I think Simon's 7 points up there are absolutely key. And I wonder whether we need to really think around aid mechanisms a little bit. Perhaps it's another debate, perhaps for another day, but have we got lessons to learn from budget support, sector-wide approaches, maybe other bits of where ODI have been doing some very interesting work? Certainly projects and programs are absolutely fraught. The Paris agenda, the Accra agenda, just doesn't exist on the ground in Ethiopia at this point in time. So we are going to have to look at other mechanisms for delivery.
Thanks, Philip. I mean, there are some subsequent sessions in the climate finance series which are going to be dealing with some, so that's a very nice trailer for them. Yeah, there were one or two more at the back there.
Hello, my name is Helen Edmondson. I work in the Department for Energy and Climate Change in the Climate Finance team. Just thinking about some of the points that both Neil and Simon mentioned about equity, of how we distribute UK aid for climate finance, of which we have 2.9 billion over the next 4 years. Mitigation, obviously a global public good, and one might argue more of a top-down approach, which might end, as Simon suggested, in middle-income countries doing innovative projects rather than maybe in your sub-Saharan African countries. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on particular guidance or criteria by which we should be thinking about how you would want to allocate your money to tackle both of these challenges of global public good and development.
Thank you. Claire.
Thanks. Claire Melamed from ODI. I just want to respond quickly to the point that Simon just made about targets for inequality. I think you're completely right. It's a political non-starter to have a target for the Gini coefficient, for example. But I don't think the only alternative is a sort of process targets around human rights, for example. I mean, a different way to do it could be to, for example, have targets that were specifically focused on progress within the bottom quintile. Or, I think there are other ways of approaching equity that which fall between those two extremes and maybe more output focused, but not quite as utopian as a Gini coefficient. I think also one of the things that the MDGs have been very much criticised for is in neglecting the kind of issues around growth and the productive sectors. And it struck me very much, again, on Simon's presentation, that this could be a real win-win in terms of thinking about climate finance and the sort of what happens after 2015, in that as development starts to sort of come back to thinking about productive sectors and jobs and so on, and as
climate finance perhaps is also pushing in in that direction in particular ways. This is a kind of potential win-win area and something that maybe we should look at more.
Jonathan Glennie, ODI. I'm not quite sure what I think about MDGs. I mean, I agree with all the stuff on consumption and inequality. At the same time, the MDGs were not about development in general. Development in general is a massive topic. The MDGs were about eliminating and eradicating absolute poverty. And I think sometimes if we broaden it out too far to things that really are going to challenge us in the next century, and they are, and then development thinkers have to think about them, but to broaden out the MDGs too far away from the simple things of children not dying, mothers not dying, those kind of things. And my question, I suppose, to the panel is, do we think we're making progress on those issues, absolute poverty issues? And if so, maybe there is a case for being careful with that area. My second point, quickly, on climate finance is, those people interested in linking aid effectiveness lessons to climate finance will be interested in what ODI is doing. We're working very much together, the aid effectiveness people and the climate change people. But my worry is that we're already getting into the nitty-gritty of aid mechanisms, when the reality, and I very much agree with what Jan is saying, is that countries need to start reducing the amount of aid they receive, not increasing it. They've been dependent on aid for 30 years, and the fundamental problems with high levels of aid dependency aren't going to go away. And the important issue linked to that is, the more money we give as climate finance and aid lets us off the hook when it comes to political pressure for northern countries actually making the changes that will genuinely make a difference to climate change. So we come out of the buildings offering money rather than offering change.
One more point at the front, I'm afraid, and if it's quick, you may be able to get one more in, and then there'll be about 30 seconds for each speaker to respond on anything.
I'll try to be quick. Carl Schultz with Climate Adaptation Works. I'd like to amplify the question on polluter pays and direct it towards issues of trying to get the private sector through levies, but I might even suggest additional caps based on cumulative emissions to find both obligations but also a real economic incentive and individual incentive to undertake activities in developing countries, not just in mitigation but adaptation. But I want to again ask the question before, how well does polluter pays resonate, and what are the frameworks under which it can resonate better, considering we are looking at second or maybe even third best options?
Okay. Yeah.
Raffaella Bellanca, Consultant Sustainable Energy and Communication. Why do we have the tendency to separate problems into compartments? Simon before was talking about development and climate, and Camilla mentioned environment and development, and how do we integrate those. But actually the real problem is, how do we make people recognize that they are the same problem? Ecological services are a source for development. The energy revolution has the potential to be a driver for development if embraced, and a strong break if not.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to give the speakers a small chance to say anything at this point that they would like to before we close. Simon, have you got any?
The thing about all these policy instruments is that it's about the politics. And I have another section of the talk which I didn't do on the politics, but it's how do you create long-term, credible policy frameworks which will not be abandoned like the fuel levy, for example, when things get tough, and getting people to accept some of these is really difficult. Number one. Number two, on the MDGs, the sooner ODI and its friends can get a one-page statement of what they would like the MDGs to be after 2015, the more influential you would be, I think. And thirdly, this question about how would you allocate the money is a really good question. I haven't the faintest idea, but I'm coming into DEC next week, and it would be really interesting to talk about it.
Camilla.
Yeah, I guess on the MDGs, it depends how pragmatic or how idealistic you want to be. If they are meant to be a set of goals agreed collectively that get us to a fairer, better, more sustainable space, which I think they ought to be for 2030 or 2040, then I think we do indeed need to make sure that we've got things in there which may be difficult to achieve, difficult to define, but which start to set a level of ambition which currently isn't there. I veer towards the idealist, but clearly we've got to find something which is not too difficult to measure and monitor as well. But I think we will have missed a really big chance if we only focus on NDG Mark II and miss that opportunity to look a bit bigger. On the colleague who's just come back from Ethiopia, I don't think it's a question of either or. I mean, most irrigation systems have both canals and tiny little feeder. And you just have to make sure that, you know, the water goes through all of those different bits. The trouble is that it tends to just stick in the big canals, and a lot of it disappears through evaporation and other means. So that, as I say, it's not a question of either or. But if money only goes to government and doesn't get down into a much more dispersed pattern of use and need, then I think, again, we've missed a big opportunity to build tailored, nuanced, relevant capacity at that much more local level. On the polluters pays thing, yeah, I mean, I think our whole thinking behind moving towards a kind of green economy vehicle rather than the climate change language has been that it offers for a lot of audiences a much more positive, gutsy, forward-looking, private sector-led opportunities rather than, you know, cuts and difficulty and caps. But I mean, I don't think we should be abandoning the climate negotiations, but more seeing that at the moment, hey, they're a bit stuck. So how do we try and achieve much of the same movement, but through a slightly different means?
Jonathan, yes, we are making progress on the basics, child mortality, maternal mortality, basic education, but that's based on aggregate indicators. Yeah? If you take the John Rawls view, we are not doing good. Like in Nigeria, if you put yourself into the position of the bottom 3 quintiles, you're not seeing much progress. You're seeing regress. And we have to have a complete picture. Too often we are stuck with those aggregate overall national indicators, and they only tell us a part of the story. They don't tell us the full story. That's why we have proposed these equity adjusted indicators. And instead of throwing in a Gini coefficient in the MDGs, which I agree with Simon, this is politically a no-no, we have to make our indicators less equity blind. Because the way we produce our national indicators today are equity blind. They give as much importance to progress at the top as they give to progress at the bottom. And that's not fair. We have to bias that in favor of where we want most progress to go, to the people who most need it. And there is a way of adjusting some of those key national indicators, and it is politically feasible to do that, because we are talking about indicators not of equality of outcomes, but of equalities of opportunity. Because we are talking about being alive when you go to school, having a decent education. It's not equality of outcome. And politically it works. Quickly, story. I was in Pakistan, the UN man. The Prime Minister called me in his office once, late at night, and he had the Human Development Report on his desk. And he was fuming because Pakistan had gone down 1 notch in the ranking, and he wasn't happy. But that was only part of the story. The other part of the story was that India had gone up 1 notch up, and that was problem. But it means that those politicians are looking at it. You guys, what do you do when you get a ranking like that? You compare your country where it was before and where it is with, I won't pronounce the country, you know it better. Each country has those comparators. And we, researchers can... No. Belgium looks at somewhere else. Yeah? We compare with Holland, and we always lose the comparison. But that's okay. But that's where the statistics can be used to score a political point with our leaders, because they are very sensitive to those ratings. And if we create a mechanism like ODI should do that, come up with international rankings of a few indicators which are equity adjusted, and then we will get a reaction.
Thank you very much to all three speakers for also being very responsive to the comments and questions. I'm sorry to have had to have rushed you. We're out of time. I think it's a complex discussion. It will clearly continue. There's a lot of work to be done, but thank you very much and a round of applause.